Diana Hargrove pointed at the photograph on the screen, a car blackened and warped beyond anything that still deserved the word, and said it without hesitation. That car is dead. Anyone still holding on to hope is wasting my time. Every head in the conference room nodded. Every head except one. Near the rear door, a man in a technician's uniform with grease still on his hands raised his hand. "I can fix it." A few quiet laughs moved through the room. Diana looked at his name tag, Owen Calloway, Bay Technician. She looked at the photograph. She looked back at him. Then she smiled, not warmly. 30 days, she said. Starting tomorrow morning. Follow along. The man who said yes to the impossible is about to show you what that actually looks like. Owen Calloway was not running from anything. That was the part people always assumed and always got wrong. He had not fled Phoenix. He had not hidden in Dallas. He had made a deliberate calculation, the kind of calculation you make when you are 36 years old and you are a father first and everything else second. And he had decided that a smaller life, built carefully, on ground he controlled, was worth more than a larger life, built on something that could collapse again. He woke at 5:45 every morning. The alarm on his phone was set to a sound his daughter Emma had chosen, a recording of a rooster that was cheerful enough to be annoying and honest enough to be effective. He dressed in the dark, moved to the kitchen, put coffee on, and then went to Emma's room and sat on the edge of her bed for exactly 4 minutes. He did not wake her. He just sat. It was a habit he had started during the worst months, 3 years ago, when sitting near her sleeping form was the only thing that reliably quieted whatever was happening inside his chest. The habit had stayed long after the worst months had passed. Emma was 6. She had her mother's dark hair and Owen's habit of watching things longer than most people thought necessary before forming an opinion. She carried a stuffed bear named Bolt, named, as she had explained to Owen with great seriousness, because bears were fast. Owen had not corrected her. She brought Bolt everywhere. To the grocery store, to the park, to the small table near the kitchen window, where she sat in the mornings and drew shapes with crayons while Owen checked the day's schedule. The schedule on this particular Monday showed 2 transmission services, 1 brake inspection, and a fluid change on a delivery van that had been sitting in Bay 3 for longer than it should have. Owen had worked at Hargrove Automotive Group for 7 months. He had taken the job because it was 40 minutes from Emma's daycare, because the pay was adequate, and because the foreman who interviewed him had not asked too many questions. Owen had listed his experience simply, 10 years in automotive repair. He did not mention that for most of those 10 years he had been running Calloway Restoration Works, the shop his father had built in Phoenix, from nothing over the course of 3 decades, a shop that had rebuilt vehicles others said could not be rebuilt, that had become known in collector circles across the Southwest as the place you brought the impossible cases. He did not mention it because the shop was gone, not in a dramatic way. It had simply dissolved in the months after Rachel died. First the contracts, then the staff, then the clients who waited and then stopped waiting, and finally the building itself, sold to cover the debt that grief and absence had allowed to accumulate. Owen had watched it go without fighting it. He did not have the energy to fight it, and he was not sure he wanted to. Phoenix without Rachel was a city that had turned the wrong color. Dallas was not better, exactly, but it was different, and different was enough. Marcus Webb, who worked the bay next to Owen's, had noticed something about him within the first 2 weeks. He had mentioned it to 2 different colleagues and been dismissed both times, but he kept noticing it. Owen Calloway could place his hand on the hood of any vehicle in the facility, close his eyes for 30 seconds, and diagnose the primary mechanical issue with an accuracy that no scanner in the building could consistently match. He did not explain the method. When Marcus asked, Owen said only that he had been doing it long enough that the sounds and the vibrations had a vocabulary he had learned to read. Marcus thought about that for a long time and decided it was not a satisfying explanation, but was probably the truest one available. On that Monday morning, Owen was crossing the facility yard toward Bay 1 when the flatbed pulled in from the south gate. He heard it before. He saw it, the particular sound a heavy truck makes when it is carrying something that shifts slightly with every movement, something large and unstable. He turned. The flatbed was carrying a shape under a canvas tarp, and even under the tarp, The outline was unmistakable to anyone who had spent enough years in the company of American muscle cars from a specific and unrepeatable era. Owen stopped walking. He looked at it for 3 seconds. Then he turned back toward Bay 1 and continued to work. The vehicle on that flatbed had a history that began with a factory in Hamtramck, Michigan, in the autumn of 1969, and it had been complicated ever since. The 1970 Plymouth Hemi Cuda convertible, finished in a color the factory called FC7 Vitamin C Orange, a shade so assertive it was sometimes said to be visible from across a parking lot in complete darkness, was not a common car when it was new, and it was rarer still now. Of the original production run, only 14 convertible examples equipped with the 426 cubic inch Hemi engine and the 4-speed manual transmission were confirmed to still exist. Victor Ashton owned one of them. Victor Ashton was 62 years old and had spent the better part of 4 decades making and managing large amounts of money in Dallas real estate and energy. He was not sentimental as a rule. He was precise, patient, and had a quality that people who worked with him described variously as stillness or cold, depending on whether they were on the side that was winning. He had purchased the Cuda at a private auction in Atlanta the previous year, paying $900,000 for it, which was below what it deserved, but above what anyone else in the room was willing to go. He had planned to restore it, not sell it, not exhibit it for profit, but restore it and keep it. The reason he had wanted it was something he did not discuss in boardrooms or investment meetings. The reason was that his father had owned a Cuda in exactly the same color, and that car had been destroyed in a warehouse fire in 1978 when Victor was 14 years old, and there were things that happened to you at 14 that you spent the rest of your life either running from or trying to get back to. 3 weeks before the meeting on the 14th floor, a fire broke out in the Hargrove storage facility where the Cuda had been kept during the pre-restoration assessment period. The fire consumed 60% of the car's exterior panels. The suppression system flooded the engine bay. The chassis, exposed to the sustained heat of a facility fire, and then the sudden cold of the suppression water, shifted along the primary frame rail. Sandra Howell's team measured the deviation at 12 millimeters. Sandra Howell was the Director of Technical Operations at Hargrove Automotive. She had 5 engineers with her, and they spent 11 days with the car before reaching their conclusion. The conclusion was precise and professionally delivered. The cost of restoration would exceed the car's recoverable value. The car was, in their professional assessment, a total loss. Victor Ashton had listened to Sandra's presentation from the far end of the conference table. He had not interrupted. When she finished, he had asked one question. "Is there anyone here," he said, "who genuinely believes they can fix it?" The room had not answered. Victor had nodded once, finished his coffee, and left. Diana Hargrove was 38 years old and had been running her father's company for 5 years. Before that, she had spent 7 years proving to everyone in the building, including, quietly, her father, that she understood the business better than anyone he might otherwise have given it to. She had a degree in business administration from Rice and a second in finance from Wharton, and she used both the way a surgeon uses instruments, efficiently, without flourish, and always in service of the outcome she had already determined was correct. The company had grown its revenue by 18% annually for 5 consecutive years under her leadership. The Texas edition of Forbes had called her the Iron Wheel of Dallas, a phrase she had not liked but had not disputed. She called the meeting on Monday morning because the car needed a decision, and decisions delayed were decisions mismanaged. She had looked at Sandra's report herself over the weekend, had run the numbers 3 different ways, and had arrived at the same place Sandra had. Write it off, recover what the insurance would provide, move forward. She did not enjoy presenting that conclusion to Victor Ashton. Victor was not simply a client. He was the largest single non-family investor in Hargrove Group. But sentiment, in Diana's estimation, was something you made room for after the numbers were settled, not before. She had finished her presentation, stated her conclusion, and was organizing the talking points for the next agenda item when Owen raised his hand. She looked at him the way she sometimes looked at variables in financial models that didn't align with expectations with attention first, Then, assessment. He was standing near the rear door. He had been called into the meeting specifically to confirm one technical detail in Sandra's report, which he had done, and he had been standing quietly ever since. He was not young, not old. He had the kind of hands that showed their history, and he was now telling her, in front of 44 people, including Victor Ashton, that he could do what her team of 5 professional engineers had declared impossible. "You've read Sandra's full report?" she asked. "Yes? And you still believe you can accomplish this in 30 days? I don't know what their timeline was. Mine is 30 days. There was a pause in the room that had a particular texture, the texture of people calculating whether to laugh and deciding against it for reasons they could not quite name. Victor Ashton, at the far end of the table, was looking at Owen with an expression that no one else in the room seemed to be reading correctly. He was not amused. He was paying attention. "Diana," Victor said. His voice was quiet. "Let him try." Diana looked at Victor, then at Owen, then at the photograph of the destroyed car. She placed the small digital timer she kept on the podium, the one she used for presentations, on the edge of the conference table. 8 o'clock tomorrow morning, she said. "If you fail, you understand the terms." Owen looked at the timer. "I understand." He did not smile. He did not look around the room. He picked up the folder he had brought with him, turned, and walked out through the rear door. That evening, Owen picked Emma up from daycare at 5:15. She came through the door at a run, the way she always did, Bolt swinging by one arm, and she knew immediately that something was different about her father's face, because she stopped 2 feet away from him and looked at him carefully before she climbed up for her hug. "Did something happen?" she asked. He carried her to the car. "Ba took on a hard job today. He said he slipped sometimes between English and the Vietnamese endearment, and Emma accepted both without distinction. But I know how to do it." She considered this as he buckled her in. "Is it a big car?" He smiled. "Very big." "Okay," she said, and opened Bolt's ear the way she did when she had decided something was settled. He made pasta for dinner. Emma sat at the small table with her crayons while he cooked, and after dinner she drew what she announced was a picture of a car that was getting better, which turned out to look somewhat like a rectangular orange cloud, and which Owen folded carefully and put in his shirt pocket. He read Sandra's report again after Emma was asleep. All 47 pages, at the kitchen table with his coffee. Sandra was thorough. Her team was experienced, and they had been wrong about 2 things that mattered enough to change the conclusion entirely. The frame deviation was not the result of thermal distortion. It was a broken weld joint on the secondary crossmember, which meant the frame itself was intact and the deviation was correctable without replacement. The engine's condition, while serious, was not as catastrophic as the report suggested. The water had entered through the air intake during suppression and had reached the carburetor, but the bore showed no scoring, consistent with hydro-locking under compression. If the engine had not been running when the water entered, and based on the fire timeline, it had not been there was a real possibility the bottom end was salvageable. The wiring was a different matter. That was a complete loss. Everything from the firewall forward would need to be rebuilt from the original schematics. Owen had those schematics. His father had obtained photocopies of factory service documentation for every significant American muscle car produced between 1964 and 1972, and Owen had kept those binders the way other men kept family photographs. They were in a box in his closet, under the winter blankets, where they had been since he moved to Dallas. He arrived at the facility at 10 that night. The overnight security guard, a quiet man named Phil, who had seen enough unusual things in the building to stop asking about them, handed him the key card that Diana had arranged to be activated for 24-hour access. Owen walked through the empty facility to the bay where the CUDA had been placed, and he stood in front of it under the yellow overhead light, and he put his hand on the warped and blackened hood, the way he always put his hand on a vehicle he was meeting for the first time. He stood there for 3 minutes. The building was very quiet. The car did not feel dead to him. It felt like something that had been hurt badly, and then left alone with no one listening. He opened his notebook and began to write. He did not use diagnostic software. He used a notebook that had been his father's, a composition book, with a dark green cover, half filled with his father's handwriting and half with Owen's, and he wrote in 2 columns. Left column, observable damage. Right column, probable actual condition. By 1:30 in the morning, he had 7 pages of notes and a working order of operations that he knew, with the particular certainty that comes not from confidence but from experience, was correct. He looked at the digital timer Diana had placed on the corner of the bay workbench. Someone had moved it there, perhaps as a reminder or perhaps as a joke. Owen picked it up, looked at it for a moment, and set it back down. 30 days, he said quietly, to the car, to himself, to no one in particular. Then he drove home, slept for 4 hours, and was back by 6 in the morning. The first 3 days Owen worked alone. He did not ask for assistance, and no one offered it. He began by removing everything interior that remained: the seats, the dash components, the remnants of the carpet, and laying each piece in order on the floor of the bay so he could assess what was salvageable and what was not. Marcus stopped by on the morning of the second day, looked at the systematic arrangement on the bay floor, and left without saying anything. He came back an hour later with 2 cups of coffee and set one outside the bay door without knocking. Sandra Howell appeared on the 4th day. She came in without announcement, stood in front of the large paper diagram Owen had taped to the bay wall, a hand-drawn schematic of every damage zone mapped against the vehicle's original structure, and studied it for 4 minutes. "You're spending time on the secondary crossmember," she said. "We assessed that." "I know. The deviation at the frame rail is coming from the broken weld, not the rail itself." She was quiet for a moment. "We had that notation in the preliminary. It wasn't in the final report." Another pause. "No," she said. "It wasn't." She left. Owen continued working. Victor Ashton came on the 10th day. He did not call ahead. He simply appeared at the bay entrance at 7 in the evening, when the rest of the facility was emptying out, wearing a jacket and holding a paper coffee cup as though he had just come from somewhere else, and this had been an unplanned stop. He stood at the entrance and watched Owen work for a long time without saying anything. Owen knew he was there. He did not stop working. Eventually, Victor said, "You know what color that is?" It was not a question. Owen set down his tool. "Vitamin C, FC7. Victor nodded slowly. "My father's car was the same color." Owen looked at him directly. He had heard Victor say it once before, over the phone, in the parking lot 3 days before the meeting, a conversation Owen had not been meant to overhear. He did not mention that now. He just held Victor's eyes for a moment. Victor looked away first, back at the car. Neither of them said anything more. It was, Owen would later think, one of the most complete conversations he could remember having in a long time. On the 9th day, he spent $3,400 of his own money on original parts from a supplier in Michigan. Marcus found out and called him that evening. "You know they're not going to reimburse that," Marcus said. "I don't know that." "Owen." "Marcus." A pause. "You're either the most competent person I've ever worked next to," Marcus said, "or you're a man having a very slow breakdown." "Both are possible," Owen said. Diana came to the bay on the 16th day, at 7 in the evening, without announcement. Owen was welding, his face behind the mask, and he did not see her come in. She stood near the entrance, arms crossed, and watched. He was working on the fuel line, routing careful, methodical, no motion wasted, and she watched for nearly 15 minutes before he lifted the mask and saw her. He did not appear startled. "What do you need?" he asked. "I'm looking," she said. "At the fuel lines?" "At the work." He set the torch down. "I need $8,700 for the wiring harness. I've already used $3,400 of my own." She was quiet. "Send the request through Sandra." He nodded. "The $3,400? Send that too." She left. 2 days later, without explanation, without follow-up email, without anything beyond a single word in the subject line, his submitted request came back approved. He sent Marcus a photo of the email. Marcus replied with 3 question marks and nothing else. Diana submitted the approval and then did something she did not fully acknowledge to herself for several days. She began checking on the work, not formally, not through reports. She began taking the long route through the facility to her car in the evenings, the route that went past the window that looked down into the lower bay level. She started doing it once a day, then twice. She mentioned to Sandra, with studied casualness, whether Sandra had any updated assessment of the project's viability. Sandra took a moment before answering. "The cross-member work he did," she said finally. "I don't believe there's a second technician in Dallas who could have done that by hand. We tried with equipment and stopped." Diana nodded, as if this were minor new data, and walked away. She did not go back to ask more. She had grown up in this industry, or rather near it. She had grown up watching her father love it, watching the way his voice changed when he talked about vehicles the way other men talked about art. She had never learned to love it the same way. She had learned to understand it, to manage it, to grow it. But there was something in the way Owen Calloway worked, not fast, not theatrical, not interested in being watched, that touched something she did not have a ready category for. On the 22nd day, Emma was with Owen because the daycare was closed for a staff day. Owen had made arrangements for her to sit in the lobby with books and her drawing supplies. And when Diana walked through on her way to an afternoon meeting, she saw a small girl sitting very straight on the waiting room bench, Bolt the bear propped beside her, reading a picture book with an expression of intense concentration. Diana stopped. One of the front desk staff appeared at her elbow. "She's Owen's daughter," the woman said. "He's down in the tech bay." Diana looked at the girl. Emma looked up at that moment, the way children do when they feel eyes on them, and regarded Diana with full, calm attention. "Hi," Emma said. "Hi," Diana said. Emma returned to her book. Diana continued to her meeting. That afternoon, when the lobby was empty, someone left a small box of shortbread cookies on the bench where Emma had been sitting. There was no note. 4 days before the deadline, Diana came to the bay in the evening and sat down on the shop stool near the workbench. Owen was working on the body panels. The new paint had been applied in primer, and he was beginning the careful process of color matching the vitamin C orange from the surviving sections of original paint. Diana sat and watched for a moment, and then she asked, "Why didn't you tell me who you were before the meeting?" Owen did not stop working. "Because it wasn't relevant to the car. It was relevant to me." "Yes," he said, but the car didn't care. She looked at the vehicle, the orange beginning to emerge through the primer, the chrome beginning to reassemble itself into something coherent and unmistakable. "I said it was dead," she said. "You had every reason to believe that." She turned to look at him. "That's generous. It's accurate. You had Sandra's report and 12 millimeters of deviation on a frame rail. I'd have called it the same way. But you didn't. I had information you didn't." She was quiet for a while. The sound of the work filled the space between them, the gentle drag of the polishing cloth, the occasional click of a tool being set down. Finally she said, "I was wrong. She didn't dress it up." Owen nodded once. "What happened to your shop?" she asked. He stopped working. "Set the cloth down. My wife died," he said. Not bitterly, not as an explanation that required sympathy, just as a fact that contained its own gravity. Diana did not say she was sorry, which Owen noticed and appreciated. She said, "Emma? She was 3. And the shop? Couldn't hold both. Chose Emma." He picked the cloth back up. Diana sat on the stool for another 20 minutes and did not ask any more questions, and the silence between them was not uncomfortable. On the 28th day, at 11 in the evening, Owen sat in the driver's seat of the Cuda and turned the key. Nothing. The engine did not turn over. It did not cough, did not stutter, did not make any sound, suggesting life deferred. It was simply silent, in the way that machinery is silent when it has no intention of running. Owen sat with both hands on the steering wheel and looked through the windshield at the bay wall and understood, with complete clarity, that the ignition timing was wrong. The rebuilt distributor he had sourced was correct for the engine and era, but the relationship between the new points and the carburetor's original vacuum advance a relationship that existed in a 60-year-old document written by engineers who had calibrated everything in a factory with different equipment than anything Owen had available, was not aligned correctly. He knew how to fix it. The method was to adjust it manually, by ear and by eye, without a timing light, without a bench analyzer, turning the distributor in increments small enough that most people would say the adjustment was not an adjustment at all. It was a method his father had demonstrated on a Dodge Charger in a garage in Phoenix when Owen was 14 years old, on a Saturday afternoon when the light came through the garage window at a low angle, and his father's hands moved with the particular patience of someone who understood that some work simply took the time it took. He had 15 hours. Marcus called at midnight. "Well?" Owen told him. Marcus was quiet. "How long to fix it?" 9 hours if it goes right. 15 if it doesn't." Another pause. "You want company?" "No, but thank you." He heard Marcus shift the phone. "You're going to do it," Marcus said. It was not a question. Owen did not answer. He got out of the car and opened his notebook. At 6 in the morning, Emma called from the neighbor's house, where she had stayed the night. She knew without being told that something significant was happening. "Pa, are you okay? You didn't come home." "I'm okay. I'm finishing." "The big car?" "The big car. Did it wake up yet?" He closed his eyes. "Not yet, but it's going to." "I know," she said. "You always fix things, Pa, even when they're really broken." He sat on the bay floor with the phone to his ear and said nothing for a moment. Then, "Go eat your breakfast. I'll come get you at noon." "Okay," she said. "Tell the car I said hi." He worked through the morning. He adjusted the distributor in increments, started the engine attempt, listened, adjusted again. It was the kind of work that looks like nothing from the outside, a man turning a small component a few degrees at a time, and is actually the most demanding kind of work there is, because it has no external reference point. You cannot look it up. You cannot check a screen. You listen, and you feel, and you compare what you hear and feel to a standard that exists only inside you, built from every engine you have ever worked on over 20 years of doing nothing else. At 8:17 in the evening, on the 29th day, Owen sat behind the wheel of the 1970 Plymouth Hemi Cuda convertible, placed his hand on the key, and turned it. The engine did not hesitate. The 426 cubic inch Hemi caught on the first revolution and climbed to idle with a sound that was, there was no other accurate way to describe it, unmistakably alive, a deep, even, authoritative sound that filled the bay and traveled through the concrete floor and arrived in the chest of the man sitting behind the wheel as something very close to what relief feels like when you have been carrying its absence for a long time. Owen sat with both hands on the wheel for 60 seconds. He did not move. The engine ran. He counted the idle steady, clean, no variation. He listened to the valve train quiet, as it should be. He listened to the exhaust note through the primary pipes and heard nothing that didn't belong. Then he picked up his phone and called Emma. It was late. She was already in bed at the neighbor's. She answered after 4 rings, her voice thick with sleep. "Ba, I'm done," he said. "The car woke up?" He smiled. It was the first time he had smiled in 30 hours. The car woke up. The following morning, the 30th day, the bay doors were covered on the outside with canvas barriers that said "Service in Progress." A flatbed stood by to move the vehicle if needed, though it was not going to be needed. Victor Ashton arrived at 7 o'clock and sat on a folding chair outside the closed bay door with a coffee cup and no apparent need to speak to anyone. Several members of Sandra's team arrived and stood in a group near the far wall. A small number of Victor's associates, whom he had invited the previous week with a note that said only something worth seeing, gathered near the facility entrance with the polite, slightly puzzled energy of people who have been told to show up without being told why. Diana Hargrove arrived at 8:59. She wore a gray jacket and carried a coffee that had gone cold during the drive. She stood next to Victor Ashton and looked at the covered bay doors and said nothing. At exactly 9 o'clock, the doors opened. The 1970 Plymouth Hemi Cuda convertible rolled out into the Dallas morning light. The color arrived first. Vitamin C orange, FC7, so vivid it seemed to push back against the pale morning sky, not restored to adequacy, but restored to excess, to the original intention of a factory that had chosen this color precisely because it refused to be ignored. The chrome caught the light across every surface simultaneously. The convertible top was down, folded cleanly behind the rear seats. And beneath everything, running with the measured, low-frequency authority of a big block engine that has been correctly rebuilt and correctly tuned, came the sound. The crowd assembled outside that bay was not a sentimental group. These were engineers, executives, investors. And yet the sound stopped conversation. Not because it was loud, because it was right. There is a frequency, at which a correctly running 426 Hemi operates that is distinct from every other engine configuration ever produced in the American muscle era, and anyone who has heard it knows it immediately, even if they have not heard it in decades. Victor Ashton had last heard it when he was 14 years old. Owen stepped out from the bay. He was wearing the same technician's uniform he had worn to the meeting 30 days earlier, and there was a trace of grease along his left wrist that he had not had time to fully remove. He did not carry anything. He did not make any kind of announcement. He simply stood beside the car and looked at Victor. The old man walked to the car slowly. He stopped at the hood, and he placed his hand on its flat palm, the way you place your hand when you are checking something that matters. He stood there with his eyes forward and his shoulders very still. 10 seconds. 15. Then his shoulders moved in a way that had nothing to do with composure. He was 62 years old and had crossed 5 decades of hard commercial landscape without ever letting anyone see him falter. Owen stood beside him and said nothing. He did not look away. He did not make it easier. Sometimes the right thing to do is to let the weight of a moment be its full weight. Sandra Howell approached the car from the passenger side. She crouched and looked at the underside of the rocker panel, stood, ran her hand along the line of the door, checked the alignment of the hood to the fenders. She went around the car twice. Then she stood in front of Owen. "The crossmember," she said. "I need you to tell me exactly how you did it," he told her. She listened to every word. When he finished, she said, "I was wrong in the report. You didn't have enough information to reach a different conclusion." She looked at him steadily. "That's the second time you've said that to someone. It's true both times." She nodded, not the nod of agreement, but the nod of someone receiving something difficult and deciding to receive it cleanly. Diana had not moved from where she was standing. She was watching Victor Ashton, who was now simply resting his hand on the hood of the car with his eyes closed, and she was aware of something happening in her own chest that she did not have a ready word for. Owen walked over. She turned. He stopped a few feet away, and they looked at each other across the few feet of Dallas morning between them. "You won," she said. "It wasn't a competition," he said. "It was his car. I just gave it back." She looked at the vehicle. She looked at Victor. She looked back at Owen. "I said it was dead. You had good reasons. You didn't believe me. I heard something you didn't." She waited. He said, "Something still breathing." The sound of small running feet on concrete arrived before the voice did. Emma came through the side door at a run, Bolt's arm clenched in her fist, because Marcus had collected her from the neighbor's house and brought her at Owen's request, and no one had explained to her what she was going to see. She stopped 10 feet from the car. Her mouth opened. The CUDA was running, and it was orange, and it was enormous, and it was the most completely alive-looking machine she had ever seen in 6 years of looking at machines. "Bah," she breathed. "Bah, it's so pretty." Owen crossed the space between them and picked her up. She wrapped both arms around his neck, and then she leaned back and extended one hand toward the car, very seriously, in the manner of a formal greeting. "Hi, car," she said. "My ba fixed you. You're all better now." The sound that moved through the assembled crowd, the executives, the engineers, the investors, was not the sound of people performing sentiment. It was the sound of people being caught by something genuine at a moment when they were not prepared for it. Victor Ashton, from inside the driver's seat, heard it. He opened his eyes and looked through the windshield at Owen and Emma, and for the first time that morning, he smiled. Victor drove the car slowly around the perimeter of the facility, one full loop, careful and deliberate, the way you move when you are carrying something that you have waited a very long time to hold again. The sound of the Hemi moving through the open space of the facility yard was the sound of something returned from a great distance. Diana watched it go. The coffee in her hand had been cold for an hour. She did not notice. The next morning, Diana asked Owen to come to her office. She offered him a position that had not existed in the company before. That morning she had created it the previous evening, working at her desk after everyone else had gone home. Director of Classic Restoration. Full technical authority over all vintage vehicle projects. A salary 3 times what he was earning. Owen listened to everything. Then he said, "I have final say on all technical decisions. Yes. If I tell you something can't be done, you accept that without a second review." She paused. Then, "Yes." "All right," he said. "I'll take it." Victor Ashton requested a private meeting. He handed Owen a sealed envelope. Owen opened it, looked at what was inside, and set it on the desk. "I can't accept this." Victor regarded him. "Why not?" "Because that's not why I did it." The old man leaned back in his chair and studied Owen for a long moment. "Then tell me why you did it." Owen was quiet. Then, "My father taught me that a car is never really dead as long as someone is still willing to listen to it. I heard yours listening." Victor picked up the envelope and slid it back across the desk. "Then consider this Emma's tuition," he said, from Victor, "not from the owner of the car." Owen looked at the envelope. He looked at Victor. He picked it up. Sandra Howell found Owen in the new workspace. He had been assigned a larger bay at the north end of the facility, with better lighting and a parts storage room attached. She stood at the entrance with her hands at her sides. "The timing adjustment on the Hemi," she said. "Would you teach me?" Owen looked up from the workbench. "Yes, but you have to put the diagnostic software away first." She considered this. "For how long?" "For as long as it takes you to trust what you're hearing instead of what the screen is telling you." A pause. "How long did that take you?" "My father started when I was 12. I got it right at 14. Sandra was quiet. Then she nodded and pulled up a shop stool. A week later, Owen was working late in the new Bay 3 projects on the board now, the first real inventory of a department that had not existed a month ago. Diana came by at the end of her day. She stopped at the bay entrance, not to inspect or assess, but simply because she had been walking past and then was not walking past. "How's Emma?" she asked. Owen looked up. It was not the kind of question he had expected, and for a moment he simply registered the unexpectedness of it. "She read 3 words in a row this morning," he said. "By herself. Without help." Diana tilted her head. 3? For her, that's the whole world. A quiet beat between them, the kind that contains more than what is being said. "Do you want coffee?" she said. "I know a place close enough. Emma's with Marcus, so you have time." Owen set down the tool he was holding. He looked at her for a moment, not assessing, not calculating, just looking, and then he reached for his jacket. That night, after Emma was asleep and the apartment was quiet, Owen sat at the kitchen table with his father's notebook open in front of him. The page from 30 days ago, the 2 columns, the observation and the diagnosis was still there. He looked at it for a while. Then he turned to a fresh page. He wrote 3 project names at the top. He looked at the wall where Emma had taped her drawing of the orange car getting better. The rectangular cloud that she had insisted was a CUDA, and which Owen had agreed was exactly that. He picked up the pencil. He wrote a 4th name. 3 weeks ago, Diana Hargrove had stood in a room and told 44 people that a car was dead. And she had been right, in every way that a person can be right when they have all the available evidence and none of the missing piece. The missing piece had been a man who had learned, a long time ago in a garage in Phoenix, that the difference between something dead and something waiting is nothing more than this: someone willing to be quiet enough and patient enough and present enough to hear the difference. Owen Calloway had heard it, and 30 days later, on a Dallas morning, in a color called vitamin C, something that everyone had agreed was finished had driven out into the light and proved them wrong.